Good morning, Gail. It's nice to see faces. So yeah, if people want to turn on cameras quickly while we're getting settled in the room, we would love to see faces. Hi, Maria.
Hi, Maria.
I'm seeing the UK and Germany and Nicholas, Cape Town, New York.
London.
Hi, Richard. So we had planned, and the Google Doc agenda is just right below, and I think that it will open if you click on it. It'll open in a new tab, so it won't kick you out. So that was one of the things that I was told, that if you click the buttons around the screen in the session, you might get bounced out of the session, like if you go to look at your schedule. So you could have a schedule Juno tab open separately. So that's what I know for kind of technical logistics. And also when we are in our presentation mode in about 10 minutes, we'll have everybody turn cameras and microphones off except for the speaker so that the slides will be big enough. But in each of these little windows with us, there's an expand screen if you want to make the slides or one video particularly big. So I think that's where we are on the technology side of things. Any questions as we get settled? Hi, Neil.
Oh, early rise.
I can barely
It's okay. We're not going to make you talk yet. So maybe we could just do a quick around the room. I'm Erin Robinson. I am one of the conveners of this session and work with Neil and the California Digital Library on a project called Fair Island, which is based on Tetiaroa, and which is an atoll in the French Polynesian. And as we've been doing this work, we've been really, I think I've been really kind of appreciating the importance of place as a grounding concept. And so I'm really excited for the speakers that we have this morning and to start this discussion within the Research Data Alliance through this Birds of a Feather. And so I wonder if from the participants, if anybody is willing to just say hello, unmute, say hello, and what your interest is in joining this session this morning. And unfortunately, I can't really, there's not an attendee list, so I can't just
there is.
call on people.
You can click on that little icon. It's barely visible underneath the emoji.
Emoji. Oh, yeah. Oh,
there's a
got
tiny little.
I found it. Super. So I don't know. I see Maria and Catherine on. I don't know if either of you want to say good morning and unmute, or both. Maria, no audio. And it might be that there's a little source icon that makes the audio
Hear me
work.
now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, we can hear you now.
Good. I was just saying that I was just finding where all the icons are. Clearly, I pushed them the wrong way. Anyway, good morning. My name is Maria Pretzelis. I'm also at the California Digital Library, and I work with Erin on the Fair Island project. I also work on the DMP tool and do a lot of work in the machine actionable data management space. So nice to meet y'all.
Hi, it's Kathy. I actually do have a face, but unfortunately my camera is not working right now. So that's why you're getting that seemingly droid-like. But I also work at California Digital Library, and I've been involved with the Fair Island project for a good long while. And it's just great to be here, and I'm really pleased that we're able to do this and bring this important project to RDA. So
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Maria. Nicholas, I saw that you had turned on your camera.
Sorry, I wasn't quite sure if
if you were maybe taking some first ideas from the floor, but I misunderstood. Sorry.
Nicholas, I think maybe you had two windows open and there's a little bit of an echo.
No, I was just, maybe I misunderstood. I didn't know you were introducing just the speakers. I thought you were taking questions from general. Sorry, my apologies.
No, we are. No,
It's a bit
we
late.
are. We were just, I was just curious about the attendees' interest. So yeah, this was perfect.
Okay.
So who are you and what's your interest?
Yeah, in that case, I have a story to tell very, very briefly. I mean, we've just had our archive burned down. On Sunday, the mountain fire reached our special collections and devastated most of, a lot. We don't really know how much.
Sorry.
Yeah, we're all in shock, and for about a year, we've taken up a very, very complex collection again, and a lot of it revolves around space, and so that's kind of why I'm here, because it's a collection looking at I think in North America you say First Nations. Here, we've variously had the terms Khoisan or San peoples used from Southern Africa, and there was a big land claim that was successful in the late 90s, early 2000s, where land was actually given back to the rightful owners, to the original inhabitants of that land. And of course the collection is hugely complex, hugely layered, because it goes back so many years and the materials are so diverse. And so we've had to dig through and create completely new ways of registering people and places and events. And the metadata has just gone crazy, and everyone's been learning a lot, but it's been daunting in its sheer complexity. So so we're very much interested to hear more from other colleagues around the world on dealing with place-based data.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And I mean, it sounds like I also have a lot to learn from what you all are doing too at this. But also, I'm so sorry about your collection. Anyone else? Just want to say hello and your interest. Hi, Richard.
Hi, I can say a couple of quick words. So I work for Rothamsted Research in the UK. So we're an agricultural research institute, and my interest is in long-term agricultural experiments. So these are experiments which run on the same site continuously for many, many years. Our oldest is nearly 180 years old now. And so for us, a good characterization of the environment in terms of things like soil and climate is very important, and understanding how that changes over time. And we also are part of a network of similar experiments globally. So there's about 100 long-term experiments from all the continents represented within that network. So again, it's the same kind of problems, that understanding the environment in terms of space and time. We also, along with several others, have long-term physical are also mentioned in there. This is things like soil and grain samples and vegetation samples over time. So yeah, just interested to find out what this group is looking to do.
Great. We've had a few more people join as we've been talking. So we're just, if we were in person, we would be going around the room and saying hello and what brought us to this session. Anybody else? Jane, I am getting an unexpected error when I try to download your slides.
Let me try and send them again.
And if you could just add them, I don't know if you can add them to this Google folder. I'm just putting it in the chat. And for everybody who's joined, the slides are also in the agenda or in this Google folder that I just put in the chat. So if it's easier to follow along that way. So I think that we will go ahead and we'll move to the presentation part of this this session. And so we have asked Kirsten Leonard, Jane Anderson, and Neil Davies to give 3 talks that really set some context about place and provide a sense of the scope of place-based research and the related data practices and issues around these case studies. And we've asked them to include some kind of common framing questions as they talk about their individual places. So what defines the place? What research data is gathered and how is it managed? And what kind of solutions are emerging or tools and practices that are being developed? And so this is a 2-part session. So this first part is really this kind of context setting and the exploration of these 3 different cases. And then we have a repeat session, which will be Thursday evening. I think it's very late evening in Europe. It's late afternoon in the US for thinking about how place-based research data management connects to other RDA activities. But I would encourage you, since we are at the RDA meeting, to think about how these 2 things link together. And, you know, if there's a place for an RDA place-based data management interest group moving forward. So that was the goal of this, is to kind of see where we are as a community and if there's an interest in having more of an ongoing conversation and learning, you know, community of practice and learning from each other. So with that, our first speaker is Kirsten Leonard, and who's based at Columbia University. And Kirsten, I will share my screen and turn off my video and mute and go from there.
But I'm going to give you the instructions to move through the slides.
Yep,
right?
and you'll give me the, yep, that's perfect.
All right.
Okay.
Coming. Not yet. There. All right. Well, thanks, Aaron, Neil, and everybody else for allowing me to contribute to this Bird of Feather session. I went a little back and forth about which place to choose. I had 2 choices. One are these fiery places, being volcanoes that I could talk about, and they are currently at the center of some of the data management activities that I'm involved with. So that's why I went ahead with talking about volcanoes as a place. Next one. Thank you. So just for those who may not be geologists or, you know, need to kind of wrap their minds around what is a volcano as a place. So it basically is a natural phenomenon, a crack event in the Earth crust, but it can be other planets actually as well, through which material from the interior of the Earth, be it molten like lava, be it gas, gas mixed with particles of solids like in ash, erupt onto the surface. The volcano is also defined as a mountain that is formed by the accumulation of these eruptive products. So it is basically a spatial feature on the crust, but it has more extension. So first of all, the vent through which the material erupts starts deep in the earth. So it has a root basically that goes deep down. Its products can be ejected very high into the atmosphere and can be distributed around the world. And when it's molten lava that flows out from the volcano, that can go for miles, pretty much away from where the actual eruption happened. What is also important to consider when we see a volcano as a place is that the eruptions that happen at a volcano can impact infrastructure and humans and society, both locally. I mean, just think of the Western US and volcanoes along the West Coast, with potential impact on communities such as Seattle. But then they can also impact globally, like we had, eruptions that went high into the atmosphere where particles got distributed worldwide. Next slide, please. All right, so as I said, you can define a volcano by its latitude and longitude, which is done in this global catalog of volcanoes that is operated by the Smithsonian Institution through the Global Volcanism Program. But that is really just the crater. You need a very different definition, actually, that is a broader geospatial area, but can, as I said, because of products going far away from being deposited far away from the volcano, you need something else to establish a connection between this place, the volcano as in its actual manifestation geospatially, and its product. And next slide, please, Erin. That is actually done through an identifier that is issued by a global organization called YAVZAI, the International Association for Volcanoes. These numbers basically identify volcanoes in all kinds of data systems. Unfortunately, it is not even accessible as a list of numbers, and it is not a resolvable and well-managed identifier, but it is governed by this organization. Next slide, please. So when we study volcanoes, I mean, obviously it's a big, big field in the earth sciences. Volcanoes provide us with a window into the deep earth. The materials that come from the deep earth allow us to access information about the materials that are down there, the chemical compositions, and so on. But what is more important, and especially in its societal application, is understanding the processes and deposits of volcanic eruptions and understanding where and how volcanoes are likely to erupt, what the hazards are from these volcanic eruptions and how to mitigate them, how to predict them, and so on. And there is a whole wide range of data types that is being gathered on volcanoes. It's mapping distribution of rocks. It's chemically analyzing the rocks, the minerals in these rocks, and melt inclusions in these rocks, and so on, to actually also be able to establish a record of the whole past evolution of the volcano. Then measurements are taken on earthquake activity, gravity, magnetics of the volcano, or geodetic measurements that basically determine changes in the shape of the earth forming through ground deformation that often occurs in conjunction with volcanic eruptions. Next slide, please. So there have been, or there are currently, a number of studies going on worldwide, and specifically here in the US, a project called the Community Network for Volcanic Eruption Response, or short CONVERSE, that is really trying to study volcanoes in the context of eruption response. In order to do that, they're bringing together a wide range of stakeholders, including academic researchers, various agencies in the US, including USGS, NASA, and so on, but also international organizations that are involved in volcano science. And they want to really advance the monitoring of the volcanoes and define communication procedures and so on in advance of looming eruptions. In order to do that research well, they also thinking about what are the critical data to collect, the samples to collect, and how can we make the samples and data from a given volcano better accessible. Next slide, please. So I wanted to focus specifically here on samples for given volcanoes. There is obviously a lot of different data to talk about, but there is, and I'm glad I heard Niklas talking about samples already, so there is clearly a common theme that we think about. So samples are collected from all volcanoes that are in some way accessible. Many are in remote locations, and therefore there may not be that many samples, but that makes those samples that are collected even more precious and valuable. Next slide, please. We can actually skip that. I think that I talked about that already. So the value of samples for Converse really is that they are representing irreplaceable evidence of the long-term historical trends of a given volcano, of the chemical evolution, of the mineralogical properties, the structural aspects of eruptions, and so on. So what is common with many other disciplines in considering the value of samples is that they record the state of nature at a given place and time. And they record, obviously, unique events such as volcano eruptions. Next slide, please. So the Converse project actually ran what they called a rock workshop that specifically focused on protocols and priorities for collecting, archiving, and sharing samples. And it clearly outlined the challenges and the needs for being able to collect samples in a consistent way for a given volcano, to collect them as soon as possible if eruptions happen or are about to happen. But there is also the issue of making available existing collections, making them more findable and accessible, having policies for their distribution, for their archiving in stable and curated repositories, and so on. So this, again, I think is an aspect relevant for other place-based data management. Next slide, please. So that is the challenge right now for Converse is, finding the samples that have already been collected for what they defined as their priority volcanoes to study, to find out if these samples are accessible, who has them, are there any policies related, sample sharing policies, or are they at individual researchers who are not really willing to share? Are these samples actually documented to be useful for any further studies? And that includes information about which volcano did they come from, which eruption did they, were they generated at, and what's the exact location, and so on. How have they been stored? Can they be reused? And then actually, last but not least, how do we find, access, and integrate data that were generated on these samples? Next slide, please. So I just highlighted a few words in all these sentences that basically, in summary, make it clear that what Converse needs are fair samples. They need to be findable, accessible, reusable, and interoperable. Next slide. So there are a number of activities and projects happening right now, initiatives that all have the common goal of generating fair samples. And what these organizations, the IGSN, which is a persistent unique identifier and an international organization that governs and distributes these PIDs, iSamples, a project to build cyber infrastructure for making samples more findable and accessible and well documented, and a research coordination network called Sampling Nature that is just about to start and focuses on best practices and policies for samples across domains. So their common goal is to generate fair samples, to ensure the persistent and unique identification of samples, cross-disciplinary metadata standards. Oops.
Hey, Kirsten, I lost my audio, so sorry. Okay, I think I'm back.
I'm nearly there.
Okay. And this is good. A quick time check, about 2 more minutes.
Okay, I think that fits really well. But now we've also lost the slides.
Okay, they should be back. Are they back?
Okay, there they are. Okay,
Great.
so we need cross-disciplinary metadata standards to document samples and basically schemas and exchange protocols for data generated on samples. And we need registries and catalogs that make samples available and findable online. So next slide. So I've just wanted to finish up with providing an example what fair samples can actually do, what their benefits are. So this is the example of a portal called the Volcano Portal, or it's still the Decade Portal, where you can access multiple types of data and samples through an online discovery system. In this case, I've highlighted here Volcano Mount St. Helens. It's very small, so you can barely see, but where the arrow is pointing at is a button that says Go to Data. And when you click on that button, next slide, please, you get, and that will be very hard to see, a summary of data available in different data systems that, are very broad data systems having global geochemistry and so on, but based on web services and the use of this Yaftsai volcano number for samples and for data, it is possible to integrate all these data into the portal and thus allow discovery of anything relevant for a given volcano in this case. The samples that are accessible through this portal are registered with IGSNs through the system of Earth sample registration, and that will be extended to other systems that use the IGSN. So it's a very broad mechanism to discovery. Okay, next slide. I think I just have an example. Yeah, this is the chemical data and shows, that these data are in multiple systems, including here at the US Geological Survey. Next slide. Same for samples. I think we can just skip that and get to that last slide as a summary. So in just responding to these questions that Aaron provided, the place here is defined by a natural phenomenon, the volcano. Many stakeholders are involved in data and sample use and curation, and a wide range of research data are relevant and need to be linked. These data and samples are the foundation of any new research and discovery, and essential to understanding, predicting, and mitigating volcanic hazards with large societal impact. The practices that I consider as cross-cutting values are the issues of place identification, of sample identification, and the link between both of them, the relationship between them. So I'm just suggesting a few RDA groups, but I'm sure there's plenty more that are relevant for this group. So with that, Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kirsten. I will stop sharing. We have time for a few questions. Anybody have, looks like maybe there is something in the Q&A. There is from Joy. Are globally unique identifiers applied to volcanic samples or just locally unique? We need globally unique ways to identify physical samples so they can be included in the PID graph. This is like a plant.
Yes, this is absolutely true. And we're, so I mentioned the IGSN, which is a global unique identifier for samples managed through an international organization. It started in the earth sciences, so volcanic samples are definitely, to a substantial extent registered with IGSNs, but the IGSN is also being applied to other type of objects, be they archaeological, be they biological, and so on. Whoops.
Great.
Oh, okay. So it's definitely part of the PID graph.
Awesome. And you've got there's some chats here. And I think in the interest of time, if you have more questions for Kirsten, want to add them to the Q&A, we can come back to a full group. And we'll move to our next speaker, which is Jane Anderson. So Jane, you can unmute and...
Okay, let's see. Shall we try this, Erin, and see if it works?
Yeah, and Kirsten, if you want to stop your video and mute. Yeah, and so Jane, what it'll look like is we'll all go away, so you won't see us, but we will see your screen. Yep. So if you go to full screen, we see it. Okay.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and particularly to Erin and to Neil for creating this session, and it's great to be on a session with Kirsten as well. My name is Jane Anderson. I'm based at New York University. This is a presentation that I would normally give with Maui Hudson, who's going to join in the second Birds of a Feather tomorrow and talk a little bit more about the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group and connect that into the CARE principles. I want to begin by saying that I'm in Lenape-Hoking, New York, the land of the Lenape nations, and do a kind of land acknowledgement that recognises the ancestors as well as the present and emerging Indigenous leaders on these lands. So this kind of discussion that I want to have is a little bit about tools that support place-based data. They're connected to the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance that were developed through the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group here at RDA. They were developed in 2018, and they address kind of questions of collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics in relationship to data governance, and are really kind of seen as complementary to the FAIR principles. So this kind of be fair and care is kind of part of how the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, which created the CARE principles, thinks about this. There's a number of sessions at RDA on the CARE principles, and I know that there's one tomorrow on fair and care and the different kinds of ways of operationalizing the CARE principles. So for Indigenous data, it can be really hard to find. As Kirsten was talking before about other kinds of data, Indigenous data just isn't fair. It's not findable, it's not accessible, it's not interoperable, it's not reusable. So the challenges that we have in relationship to Indigenous collections and Indigenous data are quite substantial, and they have legacies in colonial practices of collecting and studying and engaging with Indigenous communities, not necessarily as equals, but as kind of research subjects or objects. And those legacies carry into the future and also into the metadata. So what we might say is that for Indigenous communities, we're dealing initially with a problem of data out of place, taken from lands and waters, residing in places that are very difficult for Indigenous communities to get to, either in multiple countries or like a long way away from those communities. And this is the case for every Indigenous community. Every Indigenous community has enormous collections that are out of place. And then significant information about these collections, including names of communities where the material is collected can be missing. So this kind of question of proper provenance and information, which tends to just wasn't collected at the time, wasn't necessarily thought to be important, turns out to be really important, but you can't retroactively go and manage that easily. What we're trying to do with some of the tools that we're developing is address some of those challenges, because these mistakes carry into the metadata and into the digital lives of this material. And as there's more researchers working and collecting data from Indigenous community contexts now more than ever, it's kind of beholden to us to actually think of better strategies in relationship to that responsibility to connect people and place. So this project, Local Context, which has the traditional knowledge labels and the biocultural labels, was developed about 10 years ago to really bring Indigenous responsibilities, protocols, concerns for provenance and permissions back into the life of collections and back into the lives of data. There are 18 labels that we've developed through partnership with Indigenous communities over this 10-year period, and they reflect different kinds of concerns about how particular kinds of collections and data should be managed and used into the future. These are 3 labels that I think are particularly pertinent for our conversation today. The attribution label, which brings communities' names back into the record. This is a label that almost every Indigenous community that's using the labels develops first, just because of the erasure of Indigenous names and what that kind of means to be connected back to data in a way that's meaningful. We have the seasonal label, which is a really interesting label that connects knowledge to place and or teachings and learnings to place. So for example, certain kinds of songs should only be sung while say for example sweetgrass is being harvested. Those songs are not sung at any other time of the year. They're only sung very specifically during that harvest. Similarly, certain kinds of stories like bear stories should only be sung or only be told in summer. They shouldn't be told over the winter. And so the seasonal label really connects knowledge and people and place to land. And that's been really important for the communities that we work with. This is an example of, let's see, this is an example of a traditional knowledge label, the attribution label, being used by a community, the Scowlitz Band of the Stolo First Nation in British Columbia. And here you can see that they've customized the attribution label in their own language, Halkamelum, to Squix Quas Tek Tumuk, which literally means name and place. So if you start thinking about these questions of provenance and attribution and the ways in which communities make that meaningful is through recognition of place. And many communities' names also reflect place, hence that kind of importance of putting them back into the record. So this is just an example of connecting data back to place. This is a example of the labels being utilized in the Library of Congress. This is a Passamaquoddy 31 wax cylinders that were recorded. They were the first recordings made on native lands in 1890. This is the record as it used to stand within the Library of Congress. Here we know, it's very clear, we know very little about the recordings. We know a lot about the technology, but not about the content. And this is kind of what the updated record looks like now with community input and engagement and definition and traditional knowledge that's been added to the record. And you can see on the side the traditional knowledge labels of the Passamaquoddy have been added to this online record. They chose to use the attribution label, the outreach label, kind of say this is material that we're very happy to be circulating, knowing that it comes from us, comes from Passamaquoddy, but we ask you them not to use it in commercial ways. What's been important about this project is then the question of where do those traditional knowledge labels sit. They're digital tags. They have the icon remains the same and the customization sits as the metadata. And then the question arose, where do they sit within Dublin and Darwin core infrastructures? And the decision at the Library of Congress was to place that within the rights field. And so you can kind of see that here. But more than that, it was really important that the Passamaquoddy also had a connection to these recordings on their own lands. And so they developed their own content management system that could hold the recordings, but also all the different other narratives that connect to those recordings and connect to place. And in many ways, activate a kind of a temporal sovereignty, this relationship to the past, to the present, and to the future through a Passamaquoddy ontological framing. So through this work, and particularly working with Maui over the last 2 to 3 years, we developed also these biocultural labels. And the biocultural labels, very similarly to the traditional knowledge labels, are trying to connect people in place, but in a different kind of way, and particularly referencing genetic resources, genomic sampling, and the different kinds of research that happens around biodiversity on Indigenous lands and waters. So there are 6 of these labels that we've developed so far. Ones around provenance, consent verified, also thinking about how these labels can be used to help researchers build better relationships with communities moving into the future. The labels do or are resonant with particular kinds of international treaty-making context, like the Nagoya Protocol, and they do map onto some of the key access and benefit sharing principles that come out of the Nagoya Protocol. And this is just an example that Maui would normally speak to. This is on his traditional territories of Whakatohea in New Zealand, or Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the red line demarcates the traditional water territories or water rights. And they have been engaging with open ocean mussel farming. And through this kind of project have also identified particular traditional knowledge that exists on these lands, whilst there's a whole lot of other scientific research going on around the sequencing of particular species that are on these lands. So connecting particular kinds of traditional knowledge to the sampling that's happening at the same time, and then utilizing the labels to kind of demarcate those rights and interests that remain not only with the samples, but also kind of help guide how they should be used into the future. So this is an example of how the traditional knowledge notices and labels are being incorporated into, this is Geom, which is a metadata database for genomic sequences. Here, this would allow for researchers to add a traditional knowledge notice to any samples that they're uploading into Geom, and by doing that, disclosing Indigenous rights and interests that exist there. So keeping place with the data. So that was probably a speed go through of what is obviously a very complex project. And so I'll stop there, and if there's any questions, happy to have that, and also to move the conversation into that secondary space with the next Birds of a Feather with Maui tomorrow. I can't hear you, Erin. Maybe it could be me. Okay, I think I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, and so Nicholas, do you have a question or a comment?
Yes.
Yeah.
First of all, that was amazing. That was really, really inspiring. To you know, we'd heard about some of this, but to see it presented in this way was very inspiring. I was wondering how we could stay in touch to. For us to ask to pick your brain a little bit more, because we've been building a kind of showcase very much in community with those few knowledge bearers that are still alive, but these engagements are incredibly precious, and there's not always a lot of opportunity, and we don't want to get it wrong. At this very late point, So I don't know if you're open to carrying on the conversation.
Absolutely. I just put my email in the chat, so feel free to email. I can absolutely carry on that conversation.
I also hope that we'll have a little bit of time for 10 minutes of deep dive breakout conversation. So hopefully we'll get there too. And then there was one other, I think maybe it's a quick question from Joy asking if the TK labels, when she says the TK labels are great, and then wanting to know if they're machine readable too.
Yes, they are machine readable, and they have permanent identifiers that go with each label as well. So there is the capacity to track and trace them into the future. We have actually learnt a lot from Creative Commons, and they function very similarly. So they're human readable and they're machine readable, and that's kind of really important for them to be able to travel with the data across multiple platforms. But at the same time, Creative Commons didn't create permanent identifiers for their licenses. So they only have a database of the set licenses they have. They have no idea where their licenses are or how they're being used. So for us, that's a really informative way of going, okay, well, we actually really need to have that as kind of part of any kind of future use of Indigenous data, and the capacity for, Indigenous data to be able to identify what Indigenous data sets are at one level, but also then to kind of be able to deploy Indigenous data sets in any kind of machine learning algorithmic framing is really important to be able to have that as well. So that's kind of part of the labels. Nice.
Awesome. Cool. And I appreciate that people are active in the chat and in the Q&A. It's nice to know that people are here. Thank you so much, Jane. And so now we'll move to our third formal presentation, and then the next half of, or the next kind of third of this session will be breakouts where you have a chance to talk to one of these speakers more in depth if you are inclined. So our third speaker is Neil Davies, and Neil, I can share my screen, or you can try to share. Which would you prefer? I have your slide ready to go if you want.
Why don't you do it? Because I haven't tried this platform before. So.
I got it. Okay. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to turn off my camera, and I'm going to mute two.
Great. Okay, thanks, Aaron. Well, I've just about had some coffee now, so hopefully I'm not too incoherent this morning. Very early here, but so it's really nice. I'm going to give a talk, just to give a sense for the kinds of intensive research that's conducted at some places, scientific research, which I think will touch on some of the points mentioned also in the previous two talks. Next slide, please, Aaron. So I'm actually sitting on top of a volcano, or rather an ancient volcano, fortunately, the island of Moorea in the South Pacific in French Polynesia. And one characteristic of this island is we have two international research stations here, long established, carrying out intensive studies on the biological, physical, and social aspects of the island. We're just off the coast of Tahiti. You can see in a little map up there, and there's also an atoll just offshore called Tetiaroa, where we have a new research station that just opened, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. Next slide. So just some words about the station I'm director of, the University of California Research Station, the South Pacific Research Station on Moorea. Next slide, please. And just an example of one of the types of research we host here, we're across all scientific domains and indeed the humanities. This is one of our major programs, which is the NSF Long-Term Ecological Research Site, which is part of a network of sites that the National Science Foundation in the US funds to carry out long-term observation experiments and modeling to understand how different ecosystems function. And we represent we're the coral reef, the only coral reef in that NSF network. Next slide, please. And that's part of a global collaboration of long-term ecological research sites. I think you can click again, Aaron. So we're on Morea there, and you can see there's a number of these intensively studied places around the world collaborating on understanding how ecosystems function, collecting samples and data from remote assets like satellites, as well as these are in situ ecological research sites. Next slide, please. Another aspect is that we're on Polynesian land here. The University of California owns this land, but we share half of the property with the Tahitian people and a community group for studying traditional knowledge and educational programs run at the Atatia Center by a local community-based organization called Tipu Atatia. Next slide, please. And they, as I say, run traditional knowledge programs, a very deep understanding of this island, from the Polynesian experience over many generations, of course, building up this traditional knowledge. And being with the scientific station and this community center co-located in the same place, we have this operation for collaboration and bringing together traditional and local knowledge with new scientific knowledge. Next slide. So broadly, what we're addressing, the goal of our research is really to understand place in the context of sustainability, environmental justice, and also how we can achieve locally the sustainable development goals that have been developed globally through the UN is sustainability agenda. Next slide. Scientifically, one of the big challenges here is how do we connect the very large scale, the planetary scale and climate models and so forth, with local impacts. In our case, particularly what happens on a coral reef, and downscaling some of those global models, connecting them with local processes. Next slide. So for example, if you want to understand the impact of carbon and, say, ocean acidification, that's a global phenomenon. We have to study that at a global scale. Click again, please, Aaron. But we also have to understand how, say, different species of coral respond to the rising acidity of the ocean. And that to do that, we have to have studies carried out at a very local scale within the cells of looking at the calcification pathway. In different species, different genomes, different genetic strains will maybe respond differently. Click again, please, Aaron. So that means we really need to collect data and samples from the very local scale and study the planet from the genome up, but also satellites and other forms of data studying the planet down. Next slide. So that's a vastly complex problem, but in science we've addressed these problems. Essentially, we're trying to build a model of the entire planet. We've addressed these complex problems in science before, for example, in medicine, by focusing on particular model systems that are tractable to study and can reduce some of that complexity. You can click again, Aaron. So our approach here is, rather than studying at the scale of the planet, we can go still from genome up, but we only have to go up to the size of, say, a small island that can act as a microcosm for some of the diversity that we find at the planetary scale. Next slide. So we've been developing a roadmap for how to build not these model organisms as used in biomedicine, but model ecosystems, including the social component of those systems. And some of this we can share with, say, systems biology, some of the approaches. One, taking a systems approach, it's important to have as complete a list of the parts of that system as possible, and then go through how they interact with each other, how that takes shape over time to build up predictive models ultimately. Next, click again, please. And so we've been doing this and trying to implement this roadmap for the last few years. Click again. Leading up to this project I'll come to in a minute, called the IDEA project, building these digital ecosystem avatars of entire places. Next slide. So we, through an international collaboration, put together this initiative to build these digital simulations of a place in order to understand how it might change under different scenarios of environmental change and human activity, including management and policy decisions. Next slide. So the general approach, click once please, is to take the overwhelming complexity that we have either in the natural environment or in a built environment, and of course increasingly those two are the same, and using these model systems approaches, whether they're relatively natural systems or some of the intensively studied urban systems around the world, as microcosms. Click again. And to use this knowledge to aid design and future decisions and policy to build resilience and well-being and achieve those sustainable development goals. And we'll hopefully see this fusion of the natural and the built environment in that design. Is that maybe some cities will incorporate more nature in them, and for better or worse, natural systems are incorporating more humans activity. And how can we build these more harmoniously to promote resilience? Next slide. So this has some resonance with what's a kind of a growing movement coming out of industry, building these digital representations. It's typically being called digital twin approach from industry. Digital representations of bridges or cars, or including now people in medicine. Next slide. And so digital twins, here from the Open Data Institute, a really good definition of what is a digital twin is supposedly a realistic digital representation of assets, processes, or systems in the built or natural environment that enable decisions to be made. So there's feedback from sensors, Internet of Things, go into some kind of decision-making process, some computational process that can then return back to the system and take actions and influence it, potentially in real time. So that's the concept from digital twins. But as you can see there in that quote, some domains like weather or policy can be modeled, but at this point are not considered in the scope for digital twins. Next slide. And this, our approach around avatars is where we really don't understand the system. We didn't build it. What we're learning about the system, we can make some predictions, but we're certainly not claiming that we have a twin, a clone of the system. We know we'll never really get to that in these very complex natural systems. But nevertheless, the digital twin, as they move into more social ecological systems, are joining up with the avatars. And these are really collective intelligence frameworks to providing data and knowledge to support decisions. Next slide. And with artificial intelligence and machine learning and a lot of computational advances, the decisions humans have to make are increasingly supported by machines. And there's hope that the AI, if it's made generally available, will be able to support us attain the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide. But machines aren't born, as smart as they might be, they're not born with all this knowledge embedded into them any more than we are as humans. We need to go to school, so do machines. Where do they go? Where do we go? Take again, please, Aaron. And what we need with, yeah, you can keep clicking through this slide. What we need as we generate artificial intelligence is, of course, good data. Machines need data and models to learn from. Next slide. So in these social ecological systems, that poses an immense challenge. In each of the domains that we work in, which again span most of the sciences, including into the humanities. How do we integrate all of these data across these different domains? Click again, please. And that's why we're here at RDA, of course, is that this requires a lot of standardization and tools within domains. And in part, that's to enable the integration of data across domains to feed into these models of understanding and ultimately influence decisions. Next slide. And a sort of fundamental part of that, of course, are the fair data principles, and how can we, and now I'm speaking really as a director of a research station, we're at the field, we're kind of gatekeepers to some extent. We support the generation of data at the coalface. And how can we do this to ensure that data and samples are as fair as possible, as soon as possible? And we provide infrastructure at these field stations, and so we have a role to play in this process. Next slide. And of course, the other side of fair is that the fair data principles need to be fair socially and just, not just in the sense of making them available for machines, but that this is something that's fair to the communities, the people who are most concerned by those data in the context of today. Those are the people in those places. Next slide, yeah. So this Fair Island project, which some of us are on the call here today, aims to kind of use this fact that we have this gatekeeper at the field station. We have a new field station I mentioned earlier on this little atoll. So we were thinking, what if we could build a sort of utopia on an island, but what is the utopic, the best ideal set of principles and tools that could be made available to researchers in the field, in a place, immediately? We could bring all this together. Many of these tools and standards exist, but they need to be connected and used. And how can we promote that? Next slide, please. So the vision of the project, which I'll talk a bit more about later, is to develop what are the optimal data policies and technical infrastructure necessary to create an environment where all data and knowledge is collected at a place, in this case using our island as an example, and these data and samples made openly available as quickly as possible. Next slide. And I'm pretty much finishing up here. And so our focus areas that we're working on are first of all, a data policy. What is an ideal data policy for a place? And again, remembering that we have this role to some extent as gatekeepers to that places through these research stations and partnerships with the local communities and stewards of those places. Employing tools like particularly data management plans, integrating with existing infrastructure to be able to implement those policies and to iterate that for our example place, and then to replicate it out to other places and other contexts around the world. So we're doing this with a sense that this is something that can then be scaled horizontally. And I think next slide, I think that's the, and yeah, so just today's session maybe would be interesting, and tomorrow to talk about the draft data policy that we've put together for this one island that you are. Thank you. I think that's the end there.
Can you hear me?
Can now, yeah.
Okay, great. Super. So thank you. I'm just looking in the Q&A. I'm seeing lots of IGSN questions in the Q&A, Kirsten. So I think any quick questions for Neil? Or anything that the CDL team wants to add or comment on? Great. Well, we are right on time in our agenda for heading into, actually, we're a little late, but we have a few minutes to head into a breakout session, about 10 minutes. And so Jane can only stay for a few more minutes, so I'm going to put Jane and Neil in breakout B. And Kirsten, if you and we can go to breakout A. And Kevin, I see you.
Sorry, I'm just here in case anyone needs any help getting into the breakout rooms. That's all.
Awesome. Super. Thank you for being here. This is my first time joining a breakout. So, so Neil and Jane will go to breakout B. Kirsten and I will go to breakout A. If you scroll down, you can see there are 4 breakouts. We're not using C and D. So if you just want to pick who you would like to have a little bit more of an informal discussion, and then we will come back at 16:15 UTC, so just about 10 minutes. Any questions before we move to those breakouts? So really, what stuck out to you? This is a time to have a little more conversation about the place-based data management aspects.
Did you, sorry, Erin, did you say Neil and I in A or B?
B.
B.
Do we get moved back automatically, or do we have to leave ourselves?
You'll come back. You'll be rounded back up, but it's not automatic. That's a good point. So at about 15 past, wherever you are, come back to the main session.
Okay.
Yeah. And just to make clear, you go into the breakout room just by clicking on them. When you click exit from a breakout room, you'll automatically end up back here.
Great. Good. Okay.
All
So
right.
I'm gonna head over.
It's a very psychedelic picture. Is that? I thought my monitor broke.
No, yeah, it's I set it up as a social media avatar. I don't know, something like 12 years ago. I mean, it's fine when it's a tiny little icon, but yeah, on that scale, it looks a bit scary, doesn't it?
Yep.
Totally. Totally great. So that was just I think as much as anything is just building connections across who is in the room. So any comments from the breakout? Anything anybody wants to share?
Neil and I were talking about what we were going to do as far as incorporating more of the tiki labels and a lot of the stuff that Jane talked about, and how we can really incorporate that explicitly into Fair Island Project and the policies and tools that we roll out for other field stations.
Cool.
So, yeah.
So, I mean, I was actually going to ask Erin and Neil in some way, what is your takeaway? Do you feel that there is enough common interest, enough synergies to move forward with an interest group or working group on some aspects of what was discussed?
I mean, I certainly felt like the three talks fit nicely together. I mean, I know that we designed the session, and so that was intentional. But yeah, Neil, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it was really, Kirsten, I didn't know much about volcanoes, so I mean, it was really, but it was very interesting. One, I mean, talked a lot about obviously the geological aspects and the deep time and understanding the sort of physical geoscience of it, but clearly there's also a lot of application in which you mentioned, the response to when they go off, disaster response and those kinds of decisions, and including the science that gets triggered when that happens, right? So being ready for that and having to collect these data in what are presumably can be very trying circumstances. So being prepared to respond, not only to get people safe, but also to get data on what's happening during those events, those disaster events, including the response itself. So presumably learning from what works and what didn't work in the way emergency teams or whatever work. I think that's an extreme example of the importance of having place-based understanding. But those examples are some of the most important, of course.
I mean,
one question I had about a data-related question, there was also the idea of the volcano, which I thought was, and I know there was some talk about soil sites, Rothampton, I think, but So this is something that has come up a lot too, is about an identifier for the place, and the place being a human construct, social construct, is incredibly, there are so many dimensions to that. How many identifiers would you have? And at some level, they're all unique, because the place is unique to every individual.
Yeah, that was exactly my point that I wanted to make, because that came up in the discussion also, that what was it, the FAO assigning DOIs to sites. We have that challenge in the IGSN that some say, I want to register a site with an IGSN, but it is not really a physical object or a sample it's more of a sampling feature in the context of observations. But that's I see as a really important discussion to have, because so much actually revolves around a place. And as you said, a place with definitions that pertain to a given purpose. You can define, as I mentioned with the volcanoes, right? The whole tephra community looks at deposits of tephra hundreds of miles away from the volcano, so they want to make a connection in a different sense as somebody who's interested if that lava flow hits their back door, right? That's two different cases where you in both cases need an identifier for what you define.
Yeah, what are the boundaries of, this is huge, the boundaries of place? Like, where's the frontier, where's the border? Which is important for so many domains. But so one thing we've been working on with the Genomic Standards Consortium and around observations of genetic data is the idea of the place that it comes from. And so there was some work on a minimum information we ended up with the minimum information for an observatory. The observatory is a kind of place, or at least one social construct of a place. And so that was something we started to explore. And LTR, Long-Term Ecological Research Network, has done a lot of work on also having a sort of standard metadata for their research sites. So that was something. There's obviously overlap there, and I wonder if would that apply to volcanoes and other ways that people think about place in the context of an observatory, places where kind of they're being defined by the objects of study. It's not the only way, of course, of defining them, but it's one important way to limit a place.
So Richard noted that he was interested. Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think one of the things we're curious about is if there's a place that this could have a home in something that already exists, so not needing to start something new. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on where this might go, or other connected. So we're going to hear in session 2 from the DMP Common Standards, because of our linkages to the DMP tool, the Data Policy Interest Group, and then the International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group. Kirsten also mentioned the ESES. Richard, come back. Are there other groups we should be thinking about connecting to?
I think the IGAD group is definitely worth connecting to, especially I think they're going for a community of practice, I think, status at the moment. And in the IGAD session this afternoon, there was a presentation from somebody who's involved in the OGC Open Geospatial Consortium as well. So they're quite interested in being more involved with the IGAD COP.
Yeah. That would be super. Yeah, OGC was one that we couldn't get into our session, so I'm really happy to hear that there's somebody that was connected on that side at that session earlier. That's super. I'll go back and look.
Yeah, I for FAO, I've been contacted in the past. It's people building registries of places that are being studied. For obviously, that would be for agricultural, terrestrial, ecological sort of studies. I'm not sure. You know, you fill out the information and then you don't hear anything ever again. There's been a lot of attempts to build registries of these places worldwide.
Yeah,
and that's still very incomplete, I think.
Yeah, and there's thinking to what you were saying, Neil, about defining place with minimum schemas, and there's a few things that I've been involved in and know of. So in the agricultural space, there's the Global Long-Term Experiments Network, which has a minimum information schema for defining an experimental site, and that's very similar to the MIAPI schema for phenotyping, plant phenotyping data. And again, there's a relationship with those to the INSPIRE schema and things like the LTERs, long-term ecological networks as well, and how they define place.
So a lot of them would presumably there'd be some fields which will be shared across those.
Yes.
And there's some that are, you know, agriculture is going to have some specific metadata that are important in that domain. That might be interesting, just mapping across to see what's in common.
Yeah, that was just something I was going to suggest. That seems to be an activity that may be a topic of next RDA session involving, you know, more of the geospatial group. And I think that would be really important to a lot of different activities in defining space or place.
Yep. And I checked in, so RDA, I don't know if this is what you mean, Kirsten, so stop me, but there was a geospatial interest group way back that Peter Baumann and others were leading, and we checked in with him about the status of it coming into this meeting, and he said that it had been dormant for a long time and they just had never been able to kind of get any momentum going. So maybe we're at the point where that momentum is there.
I mean, hearing Peter's name, was that really focusing on geospatial data, on big data?
Yeah,
probably it has a different focus than what we would be wanting to discuss, you know, which is a more, you know, definition of places and an issue of identification.
Yeah. So we are getting to the last 3 minutes of the session. And I just want to give the audience, people who have been listening, Richard, I appreciate you being so active with us. Anybody else have any last thoughts? You want to put in the chat or say out loud? If not, I can give you a sense of where we're going. So, so we have the opportunity with time zones to repeat this session tomorrow midnight, I guess 11 to 12:30 UTC AM. So it's a very late session in Europe, but it's also allows us to bring in Maui Hudson, who Jane mentioned. So we will just have a quick recap of this session, and then the presentations in this in the second session will really focus on links towards RDA. Really following Richard, your comment about where there are overlapping efforts already happening. So I mentioned the DMP Common Standards Working Group, the Data Policy Group, and the International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group will all be covered. And then we'll have a bit of time for more discussion on place-based data management, but then we'll really spend about 20 minutes at the end thinking about where this goes from here. If it's a partnership with an existing group, if it goes somewhere else. So that's where we're headed. And I think the recording of this will be shared in Juno overnight tonight, I think is the plan. Neil, any last comments before we wrap up?
No, I think that last little discussion there was really good about, you know, because kind of what is a place, and identifier on it, but then the metadata around that place, it will cut in across a lot of domains, which I think is maybe where, you know, there is a need for an interest group or an interest. It's not just the geolocation of that place that define it. That's obviously crucial, but really what makes it a place rather than just a sort of location is the contextual metadata, the different domains, but hopefully we can find some overlap across them.
Yeah, and Lindsay Barberi is just joined our session and just put in the chat that it was great to see this and looking forward to the second session, but also pointed out the RDA has been doing some work aligning with SDGs at an organizational level, and there may be some alignment there too. So I think that's a super point, Bar, and we should bring that back up in the second session. Great. Well, thank you all for coming. Thanks for letting it go so smoothly, and we'll see you around maybe at the second session, and I guess we'll just leave it there. So thanks everybody, and thanks to the RDA staff and the DCC staff for helping us make this go so smoothly. This was technically very easy. So see you later.
Thanks, Aaron.
Bye everybody.
Bye, everyone.